Hello, welcome to the first Digital Photo Mentor Process My Image webinar. I have plans to do this again, and I hope you'll be patient with me on the first one. This is the first time using this software and this interface. So I'm just going to give you a little walk around first. There's a chat window so that you can chat with fellow members in the webinar, and there's also a place where you can ask questions. So as I'm going along, I'm going to share my screen, and you'll see me down in the corner, my little head. So if you have a question about something that I'm doing on a particular image, put that in the questions section, and I will have a look at that before I move on to the next one. I'm going to try and get through as many images as I can. I've got about a half a dozen that people sent. So I want to show you a few different things, and then I will do general Q&A at the end if there's any additional ones. And I'll try and stick around as long as you guys have questions, but I don't want to keep people that have to go back to work or what have you. So let's dig in. I'm going to start with sharing my screen. Give me a second. So I'm hoping, can you all see my screen with the images on the screen? If you can, just put a yes in the chat, please, so that I can see that you could see my screen. And it says yes, excellent. And if you haven't already done so, a few people have already indicated in the chat where they're joining from. I'd love to know where you are in the world. So put your name and tell us where you're joining from in the chat so that we can get to know each other. Okay, so if you could see my images, I'm going to start. Let's start with this one. I actually have to go to the right screen. So you're going to see the side of my head because my monitor is, I have a big monitor over here. So you're going to see the side of my head. Okay, so we're going to start with this one. I've got two versions of this one. This is from Fran. So this is her RAW file. This was shot on the Olympus, so it's an ORF. So that's the RAW format that Olympus shoots. And she also sent me a JPEG. So as a test on this one, I'm going to process the RAW file. Then I'm going to copy and paste the settings onto the JPEG, and you'll kind of get an idea of how much more information is in the RAW file versus the JPEG. Okay? So when I first saw this image, the first thing that came to my mind was that I want to crop out the sky, right? So the sky really isn't adding anything. Let's go into develop. So just to back up a little bit again, we're in Lightroom. So I've imported all the images into Lightroom, which is my software preference. That's what I use for most everything. And I put it all into catalogs. And I've created just a special catalog for today. So we're only seeing those images and you're not seeing all of my thousands and thousands of images. Okay, so this is in Lightroom. If you use Photoshop or Elements or On One or something else, the processing is going to be the same idea. The sliders might be slightly different or they might have slightly different names, but you should be able to get an idea of the concept of what I'm doing and apply it into your software that you use. Okay, and if you use Lightroom, hopefully you'll get some bonus tips. Okay, so the first thing that I want to look at, and I don't know if this is work if I zoom in. Okay, so let me see. The first thing I want to show you is this histogram. You guys see the histogram right here? I don't know if it's visible on my screen or not. So the histogram tells us the information about the exposure in this image. So what this one is telling me is that it's all pushed over to the right, which means it's slightly overexposed. And there's a gap over here on the left, meaning there's no black. Okay, so that is an indication of overexposure. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways to correct that. Now you'll notice there's an exposure slider in Lightroom and in most programs, but that's not the main way that I'm actually going to do that. Okay, so the exposure slider, if you can watch the histogram again, if I put my mouse on the exposure slider, it's very subtle. I don't know if you can pick it up or not, but on the histogram, in the middle, there's a gray band that's slightly lighter. Okay, so it's in this middle section here. Okay, and that's what the exposure slider affects. Okay, if I go to the white, you can see that it's way far over to the right now. It's only affecting this little section of the graph, which means the brightest parts of the image that are pure white to really light. If I go to the highlight slider, it's affecting tones that are just slightly darker than highlight and just slightly darker than pure white. And you can see that on the histogram as well. Okay, so what does that all mean? I'm going to start with the exposure slider. So what I tend to do, and I recommend, especially if you're starting off with processing, is take your sliders all the way to extreme so that it looks ridiculous, and then come back again. On the JPEG, come back again so that you're seeing sort of what's possible, and then finding the middle ground somewhere in between the original and all the way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull the exposure slider up and down so that you could see what happens to the histogram. So watch the histogram, particularly on this one. So notice how it's kind of pulling it all to the left as I go left, right, which is darker. And then as I go to the right, it's pulling it all to the right, okay? But it's not affecting sort of the edges so much, because what the exposure slider is doing is it's grabbing the middle of the graph and it's pulling it that way, okay? Watch the difference if I pull the black slider, for example, okay? The black is only pulling the graph to the left. It's not affecting the right side. The white only pulls from the right. It's not affecting the left, okay? So understanding what each of the sliders do is going to help you process your image in a more effective manner, okay? So a lot of people will pull the exposure slider for something like this, and I'm actually going to start with the others. Now, just a little tip here, what I'm doing to reset them is just double click on the actual word itself, okay? And that resets it to 0. So I'm actually going to start with the blacks, and here's a little trick. If you hold your Alt or your Option key down on your keyboard, click on the black slider, everything goes white, which means it's showing me anything that is clipping on the black end of the graph. And we know that to be nothing because it's not touching the right side, the left side of the graph. So I'm going to take this black slider, holding my Alt Option key, and pull it to the left until I see some clipping, okay? Now, normally you don't want clipping, but in the case of the blacks, I actually do. So I leave my slider about there, okay? So I'm just going to do a quick before and after just of that one thing to show you what it's done. So I'm using my backslash key. Okay, so see how it's just added a bit of contrast without adjusting the overall exposure. Okay, so I've added blacks. So now I want to bring back the highlights, which are the parts that are sort of squished up at the top on the right side of the graph. But before I do that, I'm going to crop the image, because where it's clipping, I'm going to use my Alt key again, is that sky. Okay? And I'm not going to adjust the whole image just for the sky, because if I crop it out, I'm going to be losing highlights in the rest of the image. Okay? So I can bring my highlights down and get rid of the sky that's bright, but look what happens to the rest of the image too. So let's crop it first. I use a lot of keyboard shortcuts for cropping. It's R. If you want to keep the aspect ratio the same as in the proportions, just hold the Shift key down and it will keep the square the same shape for you. But in this case, I'm actually going to just come down from the top. Okay, and I'm going to come as far down as to get rid of that highlight on the hill so that I've got all of the area in shadow and the lake. Hit Enter. Okay, so now what that's doing is it's gotten rid of the bright sky, which was sort of drawing attention away from the landscape. And look at the graph now, okay? So we're not dealing with clipping anymore. We actually don't have any highlights. So I'm going to add some back with my Alt Option key pressed. I'm going to adjust the white slider. Okay, now this one, what I do is I pull it up until, see how you start to see these little highlights appearing, these little speckles? I pull it up until I start to see them, and then down until I get rid of them. Okay, so looks like about there. Okay, so now let's have a look at the before and after. This is backslash key. So all I've done really is cropped it and adjusted 2 sliders. Okay, and what's happening is I've added a whole bunch of contrast just by adjusting the black and the white. So those are generally the first 2 things that I do to every image. Is I will, if I'm going to crop, I crop it first, and then I do my adjustments. Right. So now we have a nice even graph. I've got some nice highlights and shadows. I'm going to give it a bit of clarity. And clarity is kind of another one that is misunderstood, because people say, oh, it's mid-tone contrast. It is and it isn't. I've got a good article on the website on that. So I'm going to actually, I'll give you a link to that if you want to know more about the difference between clarity and contrast. I'm going to give it a little bit of clarity. I'm also going to warm it up a little bit, and that's with the temperature slider. So I'm going to bring it up, give it a bit more yellow, and maybe even take out a bit of pink. Okay, so I'm fairly happy with that. I'm also going to add an edge vignette. Okay, so you do that under the effects panel, And I'm using the post-crop vignette. So another little trick is make it real dark, turn the feather all the way down, and then it gives you the shape of your vignette, and then just position it and shape it the way you want. Okay, so I want to kind of focus on that little tree. Okay, so that's kind of the shape of the vignette that I want. Then I turn the feather back up, okay, and then adjust it so it's not so dark. So the idea with the vignette is you want to darken the edges so that the viewer's eye comes into the center of the image more, but you don't want to do things like this. Okay, you don't want it to be super obvious. Okay, all you want to do is draw the viewer's eye in a little bit. It's very subtle. Okay, you see that? Now, there are a few other things I can do with this image in Lightroom. I can lighten the tree, or I can adjust the colors of the hills to come out a little bit more. To do that, I'm going to use the HSL color panel. I'm using Lightroom Classic, Lightroom CC Classic, so it's the most newest version, the recent version for desktop. If you have an older version, you might see black and white here on this panel as well. They've moved it now. Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to adjust the brightness and the saturation of some of the tones in this image. So there's a little circle here. I don't know if you can see that, okay? And it's called the Targeted Adjustment Tool. So when you click on it, you get this little eyedropper thing on your image that wherever you place it and click and drag up and down, it's going to affect those colors, okay? So if I click here in the water, if I want to darken the water, I just click on the water, drag down. It's not doing a whole lot, but it's doing a little bit. Okay, it's actually affecting the tree more than it is the water, okay, which is not what I expected. So I'm going to undo that. Let's see what happens if I do that on the rock. Okay, so now it's affecting the orange and yellow tones. Now look at the sliders move as I do this. Okay, so if I want to lighten the rocks, I can do it this way. Okay, and I don't want to go too far with any adjustment. I do recommend that you go to extremes, but don't leave it there. Okay, don't go to extremes so that your image starts to look overdone or overbaked, some people will call it, or just generally overprocessed. Okay, if it doesn't look realistic anymore. Okay, I want to lighten the tree a little bit. Okay, and then I want to do some saturation as well. So just change tabs. I'm going to add a little bit more saturation into these oranges and a little more into the tree. Now notice that the tree is actually mostly yellow and not so much green, okay? And that's really common with grass as well. Grass is mostly yellow, not green. Okay, so to get out of my targeted adjustment tool, I just hit escape. So another quick before and after. Lovely. Great, so that's about all I would do with this particular image. I'm going to do a copy and paste and apply the same settings to the JPEG. So let's see if this JPEG can handle it. So copy and paste is Command or Control C, just like you would do in any other program. I'm going to check everything. And then I'm going to go to the next image. And I actually have a couple of ways to apply this. I can do paste, which is Control Command V. Okay, so I get the same thing. Okay, I'm going to undo that. Or I can click Previous down here on the bottom right. Okay. So what Previous does is whatever I've done to the image that I just worked on, it's going to apply the same settings. Okay, so now let's look at the difference. I did the same exact settings on these two images. One is a JPEG and one is the RAW file, but the JPEG has gone way farther. Okay, the clarity is much higher. The image looks sort of crunchier. You can see that it's not holding the processing as well because I've taken it quite far that as what the RAW file is holding. Okay. So just one example. Now I do want to pull this image into Luminar as well. So with Luminar, I use Luminar as sort of my plugin for Lightroom. So I'll do my basic edits in Lightroom and then I will pull it over into Luminar. So to do that, I can just right click and find Luminar 2018. I'm going to edit a copy. Always edit a copy so that you've kept your original in Lightroom. I don't want to pull the raw file into Luminar. It's going to make a TIFF. Pull it into Luminar where I can process it. Oh, and it's on my other screen, so I'm going to have to move you guys over here momentarily. Can you guys see Luminar now? I'm just going to make it bigger. Okay, so you should see the Luminar interface now on your screen. And Luminar works a little bit differently. It has a series of filters that you add. So I'm going to start with none, and I'm just going to clear my workspace. And anytime I work in Luminar, I always add a layer and do any adjustments on top of that layer. Okay, so I'm not editing the original. I'm going to go to my favorites because I know there's one that I really like. I really like Misty Land. It kind of has this glowy effect. When you apply a filter or a preset in Luminar, it puts it at 100%. You can see the slider says 100. And the really easy way to adjust it is just pull the slider back. Okay? So I kind of like what it's doing to a lot of things, especially to the water. I like the effect on the water. It makes it bluer. But I'm not crazy about what it's doing in the rocks. I want the rocks to be crisp. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply it at 100%, but I'm going to mask this layer so that it's only applying to the water. Okay, so I'm going to use the brush, and I'm going to paint in. So the second that I click on the image, it's actually going to remove the effect and start painting only where I've clicked. So I'm going to paint in the water, and you can kind of start to see it come into effect. That means I can also avoid the rock here too. Okay, so look what's happening to the water. Make my brush a little smaller, get in here. Cool. I like that. Right, now if I want the background and the rocks back here to be a little bit glowy, I can add it there as well. But I'm just going to apply it to the water. Now you can turn that layer on and off and see what it's doing, or you can do the same backslash and see what it's doing there. So it's added a nice glow. Okay. I am going to add another layer, and I'm going to add a couple of filters now. Okay, so there's a dodge and burn filter, which is really cool in here, and it allows me to do tone control in certain areas. And another one, which is detail enhancer. And let's see, what's the other one? I've already added a vignette. Polarizing filter is kind of a cool one. Which one am I looking for? Dodge and burn. I'm not going to put sun rays on here. I could put sun rays, but it's kind of overdone. Okay, so let's do the detail enhancer. So you can enhance small details, medium details, large details. Again, pull it all the way and then pull it back, and then you can see what it's doing. Okay, and decide if you like it. And the cool thing about all these filters in Luminar is that, like I just did with the water, I can apply it to the whole image, or I can just paint it in certain bits. So I kind of want to add some of this detail, but just in this rock area where I want to bring attention. So I'm going to paint again, 50%, and I'm just going to add it into this little rock outcrop here. Because this rock with the tree on it is kind of what I want to feature in this image. It's like the subject. I want your eyes to go here. So where you want the eyes to go, you want it to be brighter, you want it to have more contrast, you want it to have more detail. Okay, the other areas you want to have less detail, less contrast, so the eye does not go there. Okay, let's see how that's going. Okay, not bad. Okay, dodge and burn allows you to paint in lightness or darkness. Okay, so up here at the top, you see lighten or darken. Okay, so it's a really cool little filter. I'm going to do it at a lower opacity. I'm going to say 30%. And wherever I click now, it's going to start lightening. So I'm actually going to enhance sort of the edges of these rocks. And just kind of lighten them a little bit. And, I think I've gone too far, but that's okay. We can tone it back down. So I can undo, or I can just literally slide this back. Okay. Or I can decide, I'm not liking that so much. I can just delete it. Let's try what happens if I lighten the tree. Okay, so I'm really drawing attention over to this area now. Let's hit down on that. So I can decide if I want to keep the dodge and burn. It's lightening those rocks, maybe too much. If it's too much, I can scale it down. I can also change the blend mode. I'm not going to get into that too much. I'm going to just change it to lighten. or screen. That's not good. See what I'm doing now is I'm playing with things. Like literally processing is playing with the tools that are in front of you. Okay? I'm not going to damage anything. This is what's called non-destructive editing. You can't ruin your image. Okay, you can't ruin it if you do non-destructive editing using Luminar with layers, using Lightroom. You can't go wrong. Okay, so I'm going to save this because I think I'm fairly happy with this image. Well, there's one more that I want to add, which is tonal contrast. Where is it? Find my favorites. Guys, I lost my filter. Let's try this one. Okay, so I'm going to try this one. It's adding color contrast, so that's kind of cool. So again, go all the way, bring it back. And you get to decide if you like it or not. So I'm fairly happy with that. Let's say I don't want that filter to apply. This time I'm going to brush it out because I don't want it to apply up here. So all you're doing with what's called a mask is you're telling it, don't apply it or apply it in these areas. So wherever I'm painting right now is I'm erasing. Okay? And it's a little simpler to understand than the masking in Photoshop, because masking in Photoshop, you have to know, do I want to paint with black or white? And you know, the whole black conceals, white reveals things. People forget that easily. It's pretty simple in Luminar because it's either paint or erase. Pretty simple, right? Okay, so I'm happy with this. I'm going to apply it. So it's going to save the image. It's now going to save a copy and bring it back into Lightroom automatically. So that's how plugins for Lightroom work, is they are like an extension of Lightroom. So you send your image over there, you do your thing, and then you come back to Lightroom, and you now have a separate image. Okay, so let's go over here. Okay, so now you can see that here's the original image that I brought from Lightroom to Luminar. And this is what it looks like after Luminar. Okay, so you can see what it did. It did a really nice job. Now, could I do those things in Lightroom? Probably. But there are some tools in Luminar that aren't in Lightroom, like the sun rays filter, which I'll add in another one. And I just find that it does certain things better and quicker and easier than Lightroom does. Okay? So I recommend using the tools that work for you, that you understand, and that you can work with quickly. Right? There's another, let's do the next image. I want to get through a few of these. And now I chose this one because I love the image, but it also has a different histogram. Okay, now notice on this graph that it's really kind of squished together. There's no black and there's no white. So it's not that it's under or overexposed. It's just a really flat scene, obviously because he shot this underwater, right? So let's see, this is Dan's image. Okay. So what I'm going to do is my basic, again, I'm going to start with white. Oh, do we have some questions? We have a poll. Okay, so down below your video, take a look at your poll, and you can go ahead and answer the poll now. And do I have any questions on that last image that I processed? People are saying no sound. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay. A couple of people said there was no sound. That you might have to check your speakers. Awesome. Okay. Marking is answered. Okay. No other questions. I'm going to continue with this image then. Okay. So back to our sea turtle. So I'm going to do the same thing with the white and the dark sliders again. So there's no white in this image. I'm going to bring it all the way to the right. Now look how far I have to go before I get any highlights clipping. A long ways. So I clip and then just slide it back to the left so there's no clipping. Okay, so I'm at plus 74. Okay, that's a lot of white added. Now look at, I did not touch the exposure slider, but it looks like the image is brightened. That's because of the whites. Okay, so I've now got some pure white in the image. I'm going to do the same with the black. Alt option slider till I get some black way down the bottom. Okay, so all this is doing is stretching out my graph. So look at the graph. It's now stretched out, and I've got some pure black and some pure white. I'm going to scale that back a little bit now that I've looked at the image. I don't want it to quite so contrasty. Okay, and then I'm going to add some clarity. Okay, so now clarity, any of these things that you do with the sliders in the basic panel or any of the sliders in general are applying to the entire image, okay, except for the HSL panel. Everything I do here is called a global adjustment. It's applying to the entire image. Okay. So when I increase the clarity, it's increasing what's called the edge contrast. So anywhere there's a dark against a light tone, it increases the contrast between the two. Okay, so it looks like there's more contrast in the image, but it's really the edges that are being affected. Okay, now in this image, I don't want to do that on the entire image. Okay, so I'm just going to pull the clarity up a little bit, and then I'm actually going to paint clarity into the turtle. Okay, so to do that, I want to use the adjustment brush. So you can get to the adjustment brush by clicking it up here under the histogram, the little brush, or you can get up here to your tools. I never use them. Tools, adjustment brush. Okay, I use the keyboard shortcut, which is K. Okay, so it gives me this little circle and a crosshair. I don't know if you can see that. To make it bigger, I'm using the square bracket, left and right, square brackets, bigger and smaller. Okay. And you get to decide once you're in the paintbrush what things you're going to paint onto your image. Okay. To reset it, double click the word effect right here. And I want to add clarity to the turtle, okay, without affecting the rest of the image. So I'm going to make my brush smaller than the outside of the turtle. And I'm just going to paint on my little turtle here. Okay. And I'm painting with 30% flow, so I'm not doing it super obvious. Because you want it to blend with the outside too, right? If you paint with a hard edge brush and you paint 100%, it's going to be super obvious. Okay, I'll give you an example of that. I'm going to create a new dot. Okay, so I'm going to create something that's really dark, just so that you could see what's happening. Okay, and I'm going to turn the feather. So feather means the gradation of the brush. Is it got a hard edge or a soft edge? Okay, so I'm just going to show you what happens when we paint with a hard edge brush at 100%. Okay, you get a hard edge on your painting, and it's really, really obvious. Okay, so we don't want to do that. Okay, what you can do though is paint with a lower flow, increase your feather so it's more subtle. So let's say we do want to decrease some bright areas. So I'm gonna increase the size of my brush here, and I'm just going to darken these light areas on the edge. Okay, I'm going to add a vignette anyways. You'll see that in a minute. Okay, but we can also do a custom vignette by painting exactly where you want. Now notice how much more subtle that is than just a solid black line. Okay. Now notice there's another little turtle over here hiding. If we want to bring him out, we can add another brush and double click to reset. I'm going to brighten him, give him a bit more contrast. And let's see what happens if we can bring out this little guy a little bit. Okay. Needs probably a lot of contrast. Okay, so let's see what we're doing now. Let's close that. So quick before and after. So really flat image to start. We've punched the contrast up with the black and white sliders and added a little bit of clarity with the paintbrush, right? I'm going to add a vignette again, and that is under effects. Remember how to do that. So pull it all the way down, feather to 0. Let's see if we want this like that. Now, what happens if you want your vignette off center? Okay, because this always works from the center, from the edges of the image out. Okay, so if you want an image or you have an image like this where the subject is off center, what I would recommend doing is not an edge vignette like this, is I would do a radial filter instead. Okay, you can have a look at that as well. Okay, so here's a radial filter. I can get to it from the menu up here under the histogram or the top, or I can get to it by clicking, sorry, M is graduated, Shift M is radial filter. Now this allows me to draw a circle, and I'm going to darken the edges. Okay. So it allows me to draw a circle. So wherever I click and drag, it's going to start the circle. Okay. Now you can see what's happening is it's actually going on the inside of the circle. If you want to see where your filters or your adjustment brush is applying, click the O on your keyboard, and it will show what's called the overlay or where your mask. And now, obviously, I don't want this on the turtle. I'm on the outside, so I'm going to invert that. Okay. So now it's darkening everything outside of the turtle. You can make it bigger. And you can change the feather. Let's start with something like that. Okay, so now it's really dramatic. We're not going to go quite that dramatic. Let's keep it a little more subtle, something like that. Okay, but look at what that does in terms of really putting attention on that little guy. Okay, kind of like how that's working. Now let's say we want to punch up those colors. Okay, now just by increasing the blacks and the whites, when you add contrast, you're automatically going to add saturation. It just happens. Okay, so don't touch the saturation or the vibrance sliders until you've done your contrast first. Okay, so if I want to add, again, vibrance and saturation to the whole image, I can use these sliders, pull them all the way, see what they do. Okay, so vibrance applies to colors which are less saturated to begin with. Saturation applies equally to all colors. So I'm not crazy about either of them, to be honest. I might increase a little bit of vibrance, but I'm going to go back to the HSL panel again. Okay, so I want to affect the blues. So I'm going to go click on my targeted tool, increase. Okay, if I go too far, it starts to look not realistic. So let's just keep it subtle. And maybe I want to increase the little brown on my turtle as well, give him a little more color. Okay. You can also adjust the hue. Okay, so hue is the tint. Okay, and I'm going to change that so he's a little more yellow, a little more orange. Let's give him a little more color. I like that. Okay, so pretty quickly with a few adjustments. You don't have to go crazy. You could take this into Luminar. I could do a bit more, but I'm pretty happy with that. I will leave that image where it is. And now let's look at one that has the opposite problem. I was hoping to get a scene like this with a raw file, but she didn't have the raw file. She only saw the JPEG. This is Sarah's image. So I'm going to, no, I don't want to delete it. I'm going to work on this one, even though it's a JPEG, and then you'll be able to see the difference of what happens when you go too far with a JPEG. It's really easy to go too far. Let me go back here. Are there any questions? Any questions about what I've done so far in terms of pulling the sliders, adjusting the contrast, using the blacks and the whites? Okay. So another question I'll ask you guys, you can put in the chat while I'm working on this image, is if you've been following me for a while and reading Digital Photo Mentor, or you just joined the group recently, tell me how long you've been following and what it is that you most want to learn in possibly a future webinar. Tell me where you're at and how I can help. Okay, so let's get on to this image. I always start in the basic panel. A lot of people start with lens corrections, which you can do as well. You can remove chromatic aberrations and so on in there. I'm actually going to come back to that one because this one does have some issues. Okay, so I'm going to do the highlight slider with my Alt key again. So you can see that the sky is clipping, meaning that there's no detail in those areas. Okay, this is a problem with the JPEG, that if I pull this too far, it's not going to look so great. Okay, it starts to look like it's processed, and there's just not a lot of detail there. You see how the sky looks a little wonky. So I'm going to pull it down, but not too far. Right. I'm going to check my blacks. Now it looks like this image is really dark, but there's actually no pure black. Okay, so I'm going to pull it down a little bit so that I've got some black, and I'm going to open up the shadows. Okay, now if you have a raw file, you can open up your shadows a lot without it sort of going too far, and you start to get artifacts or noise. With a JPEG, this is going to affect the image too much. And look how much it opens up those trees. If I zoom in, though, you start to see that it starts to pixelate and get a little bit noisy in those areas. Okay, so I don't want to go too far. Almost never do I want to pull the shadows or the highlight sliders all the way. Okay, you want to be really sort of subtle with your edits. I'm not going to use clarity on this one because it's already a JPEG and it's been sharpened. That's another advantage of RAW versus JPEG, is RAW files have not been sharpened yet. JPEGs are sharpened in camera, and if they're sharpened to a certain degree and you want to undo it, you can't. Okay, so that's a disadvantage of a JPEG. Okay, so I'm actually going to do some more what's called local adjustments on this image. I'm going to use this time the graduated filter. Okay, so the graduated filter comes from the edge in. Okay, so as I click and drag, it's applying it from the top down. Okay, so you can see, let's just change the color. Okay, so where you see red is where the graduated filter is applying. It's just like a graduated filter that you would drop in front of your lens if you want to darken the sky when you're shooting it. Okay, the problem with those filters in shooting, though, is that as you can see here, if I want to darken all the way down to sort of the white area of the mountain, what happens to the trees? The trees are also being darkened, right? So I want to bring the highlights down even further. Okay, let's see what this is doing. Okay, so it's doing a nice job. I'm actually going to turn the saturation down because I don't like the way that sky is starting to look. Okay, keep it a little bit more natural. And I'm going to bring the contrast down a bit and see if that helps. Maybe even clarity. Okay? So make it less sort of crunchy. And I know by doing this on a JPEG, I'm going to add noise. So I'm actually going to reduce the noise in the sky as well. Okay, so that's starting to look better, but it's still affecting the trees, which I don't want. And now this is something that's new to Lightroom Classic. You now have what's called a range mask. Okay, so I can turn on the range mask for luminance, which is brightness. So luminance equals brightness. And I can adjust it. Okay, so from the bottom, if I dial it up, watch what happens. Okay, see it disappearing from the trees? As I bring this up, it's only applying to the lighter tones, not the darker tones. How cool is that? If I go the other way, you'll see it disappear from the sky. Oops, I have to grab the slider. See how it disappears from the sky, and it's only on the trees now. This is brand new to Luminar, or to Lightroom, pardon me, Classic CC. Okay. Lots of other programs. I know that On One has this ability as well to do masks based on luminosity, as does Photoshop with luminosity masks, a little more complicated. But a lot of programs are now coming online and allowing you to do that, especially in here. It's very handy. Right? So now I can only apply this to the sky, and you'll see that it's not affecting the trees. Okay? So pull it as far as you want to see what's happening, and then bring it back. Okay? I want to shift the color of that sky. So let's get out of that. And now that I've done all that, I'm actually going to bring the whole exposure, which is the midtones, remember, not everything, up a tiny bit. And I'm going to shift this blue color. I'm not really happy with this sky and this blue. It's kind of a weird color. So I'm going to try and change the color of it. Okay, so look what happens. I can make purple, or I can make cyan. Okay, I want to go a little bit to the purple side. Let's do this. Lots of purple. Okay, purple mountains, right? I like that better. Okay, so let's do a before and after. So see how much detail, even out of the JPEG, we can pull this out of this image. I can add a vignette. So I have some presets, which you can make in Lightroom, that add your vignette automatically. Okay, so a preset is just saving a certain amount of settings that you want to apply. So I've done that. And I am going to apply the chromatic aberration. So chromatic aberration, I don't know if you guys can see this or not. I'm going to zoom in a bit more. Is something that appears where it's like a halo. You can kind of see it at the top of the mountain where there's like this purple outline. Okay, and it's a lens. It's a lens defect is actually what it is. And you'll see it often on wide-angle lenses, and especially on the edges of things like this, where there's a bright area and a dark area. You'll see a color fringe, and it's often purple or green. Okay, so by clicking on this Remove Chromatic Aberration, it gets rid of some of it. Or I can try and do it manually with this little eyedropper. Okay, so see that purple fringe there? And that's not doing too bad of a job. Right, so it actually will reduce your sharpness when you have chromatic aberration. So do make sure that you use that and remove that, that from your image. I'm going to do one other thing, and I'm going to bring another thing up from the bottom, and I'm going to brighten it this time. So I want to brighten the foreground just a little bit. Okay. Keep my highlights down. So I'm fairly happy with that. Okay, let's have a look. pretty good, right? And that's a JPEG. Now keep in mind that if you had the raw file for this, Sarah, your clouds, they wouldn't have that sort of that crunchiness. I would probably go in here and do some noise removal as well, because there's quite a bit of noise in the shadows. Where you get noise from, there's a lot of misconceptions about noise, is that it comes from high ISO, which it does. But if you're shooting long exposure, you'll get noise. If your image is under or overexposed and you pull the exposure really far, you will get noise. If you're working on a JPEG like this and you pull it too far, you will get noise. So there's a lot of ways where you can achieve noise, which also means you can avoid it by not under or overexposing, shooting raw, that sort of thing. Okay. Let's see. I'm just going to do this one real fun because it was kind of a fun image. It's a JPEG belonging to Sue. And so there's no raw file. We're going to just do a real quick edit on this one because I want to show you, she wanted to bring out the sunbeams, right? So I'm going to do the white and the black sliders again. Okay, so we do have a little bit of white clipping, but I'm actually going to increase it because I want the white clouds, and then bring the highlights down. Again, if you have a raw file, you get a lot more detail than you will from this JPEG. Now notice there's no blacks here, okay? So what makes your image have punch is contrast. And you can't have contrast without pure white and pure black, okay? So I'm going to add the black to give it some contrast. So I'm going to bring the shadows up to get that water. And I'm going to crop a little bit of the water out, okay? Because this image for me is all about the sky and that cloudy, stormy feeling. So we want to really bring that out, okay? So I can increase clarity. Let's see what happens if we do it overall. So for this image, it actually looks pretty good, right? It brings out the layers of the hills, brings out the water, brings out those rays, okay? Or we could keep it minimal and paint in a bit more clarity. So remember how to paint. I'm hitting K on my keyboard, and I'm going to paint with clarity only in the sky. So I'm just going to get those light beams. Okay. Turn on the mask so you can see. So where you see the red is where I'm painting. Okay. And all of this is non-destructive. So if you don't like it, you can delete this. You can delete this brush. You can delete this pen, or you can just undo the whole thing and start over again. Okay. Lightroom gives you a history over here on the left. These are all my presets. And you can see this history is everything I've done to this image. So you can go back to any step. The little preview up at the top there on the top left shows you preview of that step. So I can go back to any of these, okay, at any time. So there's a quick before and after just to bring out the sun rays. Okay? So that will be your clarity. So I was hoping to get the raw file of this one just to show the extreme contrast. So here's another example of a different type of histogram where it's extremely far to the left and the right, and there's not much in the middle, meaning there's lots of darks, there's lots of lights, and there's lots of midtones. And a lot of times in my classes, I will get people to bring an image like this to me and say, well, I didn't expose correctly. How can I better expose this image? Unfortunately, you can't. Your camera just can't capture the full range because it's too contrasty. So you either need to do bracketed series of images at different exposures and then merge them together in HDR, or you have to expose either for the inside or the outside of this particular scene. So either darker or lighter. Okay? Now, I don't know how far I'm going to be able to pull this because it's a JPEG, but I want to show you what happens. Okay, so if I pull this JPEG too far, okay, you're going to start to get something that doesn't look so good. Okay. Okay, so there's not a lot of detail here. If I had a raw file, I bet you I could pull out detail from the sky, outside, and inside the room. Okay, because there's a lot there. But watch how this is what I call, it's hurting my eyes. I call it neon puke, where you've gone too far with the sliders, too far with the saturation. If that's really far, that it's just so unrealistic that your eyes reject it. Okay, so try and keep your edits a little more subtle. So even if you only have a JPEG on an image like this, you can pull it only a little ways without getting too far. Was there a question? Just a reminder that there are some polls down below. So if you haven't answered the poll, I've got some people answering yes, they are processing, no, they're not. And put yourself in one of the categories. What do you consider beginner, advanced beginner, intermediate? Just check down below the video and you'll see the polls. Okay? So tell us a little bit about yourself. Well, the last one, I was hoping to do a couple more, but I want to do this one in black and white because we haven't done a black and white conversion yet. So this is, I'm sorry, I forget whose image this is. I apologize. I don't remember whose image this is, but we're going to start over again. Okay, so if you don't like your edits, you can just hit reset at any time, and that gets rid of everything that you've done in Lightroom. Okay, so what I'm going to do is, again, my sliders. I always do my white and my black sliders first, almost always, okay, so that I can set that up. Okay, give it a little bit of clarity. Most of the time, I'm not going over about 30 clarity. On people, I tend to keep it to about 25, unless I really want sort of a grunge effect. And if we have a moment, I'll do the fellow from Morocco and show you what that looks like. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is do a black and white conversion, okay? Now, there's a few different ways to do it. Obviously, you can desaturate all the way, but you don't have any control when you do that, okay? And this is what happens when you shoot monochrome in your camera, okay? So all the camera is doing is it's desaturating. This is what you got, okay? So you can't really play with the tones or adjust them at all later, okay? In Lightroom, there's a black and white. Like I said, it used to be under the HSL panel. So if you're using an older version of Lightroom, you will see it here. It's now on the basic panel, okay? And they've done kind of something cool. If they've done these different little presets, I guess you call them, where you can see what kind of look it's going to get just by scrolling your image over, okay? So you can just kind of decide, oh, okay, that's not bad. That looks pretty good. And pick one to start with. So I'm going to pick that one because it's got a lot of contrast. Okay. So let's have a look at what it's done. Okay. It hasn't done a curve. Okay. So it has done, where are my black and white sliders? I want to see my sliders. They're hiding on me. Sorry, I can't find the sliders. This is what happens when you update your Lightroom. So what I want to do is adjust the sliders, and I cannot find them. Bizarre. There it is. There we go. Found them. Okay, so once we're in black and white, the HSL panel has now turned into black and white panel. Magic. Okay, there, I learned something new. Okay, here we go. Okay, so once again, there's a targeted adjustment tool. I love these targeted adjustment tools because you can decide where you want to adjust the tones. Okay, so based on the original color in the image, I'm going to click on the leaf using the target adjustment tool and go up and down. So see what happens is it's pulling the green and the yellow slider. So if I want sort of more drama and I want the flower to stand out more, I can darken the leaf. If I want the leaf to stand out more, I can brighten it. So I want the flowers to stand out, but I don't want to go too far that it looks like that, okay? Again, subtle, gentle, subtle. Okay, flowers are pink. If I want to increase the flower brightness, I can do that. Oh, I'm affecting the middle of the flower now. That's kind of cool. So it really depends where you put your little targeted marker. I'm happy with that. I hit escape. Okay. Now, sometimes you have to go back and tweak your sliders again. I will check them every now and then to see if my contrast has changed because I'm doing other things. I might decide I want to add a tone curve, medium contrast, which is even more, or not. Okay, so I just undid, which is Command Control Z, which is Canadian, or Z, which is American. Okay, I could add a split toning here, which is adding like a sepia tone or tints to the shadows of the highlights. So another little tip for you is if you click your Alt key again, the Alt key is really magic in Lightroom, and I know that a lot of software works with the same key. When I click the hue slider and Alt at the same time, it actually shows me the color I'm going to get at 100% saturation. Okay, so I'm picking my color then I'm going to add a little bit of it into the image. Okay, so I'm gently increasing the saturation, so I get this warm brown tone in the shadows. Okay, so I really want it subtle, just so that it's not sort of a cool feeling image, because it's a plant, so it should feel warm to me. I tend to keep the color out of the highlights, because what happens when you color the highlights is you sort of get yellowy looking image. I like nice clean whites, so I leave my highlights as they are. Unless you want to do something like a split tone. So say, for example, I want to do warm shadows, or I want to do cool shadows. So I want to do blue in the shadows, and I want to do warm highlights. Okay, so that's what's called a split tone. Okay, so it's really simple to play around with the colors. Okay, I might want magenta. Very cool. Okay, or we can do the opposite, warm shadows, cool highlights. Okay, let's go with that. Cool. Again, I want it really subtle. Put my blue, really subtle. Like that. Okay, so before, after. All right, see what's happening there? It looks like it's kind of zooming in on the image. That is the lens correction panel. Okay, so that seems to be happening automatically. Okay, so there we go. Oops, funky. A question. Let me come back to the questions. Yes, Ronaldo is asking, is there a reason not start processing this image with the exposure slider? Yes, because number one, it doesn't need any exposure adjustment. Were you there at the beginning of the webinar, Ronaldo, when I talked about the exposure slider affects the middle of your image? So I'll show it again. I'll go back here. So when you put your mouse on the exposure slider, I don't know if you could see it. It's very subtle in the video and the screen, but in the middle of the histogram, there's like a little gray lighter band. Okay, so that's showing what the exposure slider is going to affect. It's affecting your midtones. Okay, and when I pull the exposure slider, it pulls the graph based on the middle. Okay, but I don't need to adjust the midtones in this image because it was well exposed to begin with. I don't need to adjust that. Okay, by adjusting only the whites and the blacks, what I'm doing is, I'm going to turn the split toning off. What I'm doing is adjusting the contrast, and I'm setting what's called the white point and the black point. Okay? I'm setting the white point and the black point. So it doesn't need exposure in this image. Okay? With a black and white, I also want to make sure that I have a lot of contrast. Black and white needs contrast in order to be really effective. Okay, so if you find that you've got a black and white image that's just not feeling very punchy, make sure you have enough blacks and you have enough contrast. So I'm going to darken the bottom of this a little bit. Okay, just like that. Okay, so if you want to make it really subtle, we're coming up on our end of our processing here. So that's just darkening the leaves a bit and keeping the focus on the flower. Okay. There's a lot of sort of little things on this flower that I might want to remove. You could do that with the cloning tool. Let me zoom out a little bit. Lightroom has a pretty decent cloning tool now. I'm not going to do all of them, but I'll do a few of them. When you paint with the cloning tool, it sort of picks the targeted area, but you can pick a different one. Or you can go into Photoshop if you know how to do Photoshop and do a more thorough job. Okay. I'll just do a couple real quick so you can see what it's doing. Increase my opacity, that helps. There we go. Opacity. Okay, so kind of, I just removed a couple of them. Okay. So you could go in and painstakingly remove all of them. And you also notice that when I'm doing the cloning, I did zoom in so that I could see what I'm doing a little bit closer. For most of the general edits, I'm looking at the full image. But when I do something like cloning, I'm going to zoom in on the image a bit more. Okay. I was hoping to add a light effect to one of these images, but I've run out of time. So I'm going to save these. The ones that I didn't get to, I may save them for next time. And if you didn't get your image processed in this one, then do submit some for next time. This is something that I plan on doing on a regular basis, perhaps monthly, and we may change it up a little bit. This one is going to be posted on the website shortly after we close it out. It will be available for rewatching if you've registered for the webinar, and if you're watching at home, you weren't able to join us live. You can rewatch it at any time. If you want to follow along and open your Lightroom, you can do that. So I'm going to be posting it on the website very soon. Future webinars will, where's my cursor? Future webinars will be only for people who are registered. Okay, do we have any other questions? Great, let's have a look at our polls. You guys are mostly processing. We've got some beginner, advanced, beginner, intermediate, excellent. Right. Does anybody have any general questions about what I did? What are you guys using in terms of software? I know we did a big poll in the Facebook group, and it was, you know, kind of all over the place. There was lots of Lightroom users, some Facebook, some Photoshop, some Elements, some Luminar, some On One, some Capture One. Let me know what it is that you guys are using, and let's keep in touch in the group. Stay active in the group. And I'd love to know what other questions you guys have about processing. Maybe we could take a particular issue that you're having and focus on that for another webinar, such as maybe HDR or processing for people, or doing a particular black and white with a sepia tone, or the whole shoot and match. So I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Just put in the chat room. I'd love to hear from you if this was helpful. And we'll stay in the groups. Keep sharing your images. I love to see what you guys are doing. And have a great day. Take care until next time.